Welcome everyone to this session of the FICCI Future Speaker Series. This series is a part of a wider initiative under the FICCI Futures Institute and is a knowledge sharing platform that attempts to address some key challenges facing the world today. Every so often, we invite and talk to thought leaders and technology futurists from around the world. And so without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce all of you to our speaker today, Piyush Gupta. Piyush is identified with digitalization, sustainability, and of course, tremendous personal leadership. These are all big themes in the world of business and entrepreneurship today. And so we are going to have a rich discussion, and I'm curious to understand some of his views and experience in these areas. A few words about Piyush. Piyush is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of the DBS Group since 2009. Prior to joining DBS, Piyush had a 27-year career at Citigroup, where his last position was CEO for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. Piyush was named one of the world's top 100 best performing CEOs in the Harvard Business Review 2019 edition of the CEO 100. He was also named Global Indian of the Year by Economic Times in 2021. Singapore Business Awards Outstanding Chief Executive of the Year in 2016, and Singapore Business Leader of the Year by CNBC in 2014. While Piyush is a real superstar, he grew up here in Delhi, where I am sitting today, and studied at St. Columbus, and then went on to do a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the famous St. Stephen's College in Delhi University, and then got a PG Diploma in Management, or an MBA now, from the IIM Ahmedabad. Piyush is also the Vice Chairman of the Institute of International Finance in Washington and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. In addition, he's a member of Singapore's Advisory Council on the Ethical Use of AI and Data, on the Board of Trustees of SMU, Singapore Management University, and also on the Bretton Woods Committee Advisory Council. He sits on the boards of the National Research Foundation in Singapore and Singapore's Council for Board Diversity. In his personal capacity, and Piyush was just telling me this, he has a keen interest in nature and particularly bird watching, and is a co-chairman of the BirdLife International Advisory Group. Of course, all of you know about the DBS Group, but as you might know, it's a leading financial services group in Asia with headquarters in Singapore. It's recognized for its global leadership, and DBS has been named world's best bank by several global publications like Euromoney and Global Finance. The bank is at the forefront of leveraging digital technology to shape the future of banking, and was also named world's best digital bank by Euromoney. Piyush, welcome, and thank you for making the time to do this.
Very happy to do this, Pramath. And we start off with you said, while Piyush is good, he grew up in Delhi. Actually, that's wrong. It's not while Piyush is good, it's because Piyush grew up in Delhi. That's why he's good.
No, I think your achievements are, and not to flatter you, I think your achievements are really something for all of us to be very proud of, and a tremendous role model for all of us sitting here in India. We've read so much about you, and of course the tremendous achievements of the bank during your tenure. I think in institutions these days, Piyush, you would agree that people don't last too long, right? I mean,
well, that's probably true. But I have to tell you, Pramath, I actually meant it. If you sit back and reflect today, the number of global CEOs who are of Indian origin, certainly all of tech, Google, Microsoft, Nokia, IBM, Adobe, you name it. but now increasingly outside tech as well. It just tells you there is something in the growing up in India which creates this capacity to be nimble, adaptive, and lead. And a lot of people try to sort of call it the Jugaad influence. I think it's a little bit more than Jugaad. It is adaptability. It is, the fact that we just have to work with a very diverse set of conditions and diverse set of people. I think all of that helps. So thank you for all the kind words, but in reality, there are a lot of people who've done what I've done, and I think being from India and growing up in India has a lot to do with it.
And what did you also, well, since we started with that, let me spend a few minutes on your early career. Was the early career after IMA mostly in India with Citi?
Yeah, I spent my first 8-10 years and I did the usual routine. I joined Citi as a management trainee in those days, and I did Mumbai, I did Delhi, I did Calcutta. In fact, my first assignments were in Calcutta. And this is exactly what I meant. So I cut my teeth on dealing with the Calcutta trade unions and the Delhi unions in the late 80s. And, once you've done that, there's very little that phases you after that.
Right. Yeah, I can identify with that. I grew up in Bihar, and from a very early age, you got, seeing a state that was sort of struggling and all of us getting left behind while the rest of the country was marching ahead. You have to work that much harder to get ahead. So that's actually a very astute observation. And you're right. I think most of us say that, somehow we are Jugadu, but, you can't be Jugadu and run a organization like DBS. I mean, it takes much more than that. So
yeah, it does. I think there's a sense of hunger, obviously, which comes from coming from India, but it is some of the other things. I don't know if you know Kamini Banga, Vindi Banga. She wrote a book on why Indian CEOs are successful.
Yeah.
And I thought she was quite astute. She came up with a few observations from talking to a lot of people. But I did reflect on this. People think Indians are all of one sort. Actually, growing up, you grew up with all kinds of people, different social classes, different kinds of ethnicity, different kinds of religions. And it's a melting pot. And so learning to deal with all of that just makes you extremely flexible. So that is an important attribute.
We'll come back to some of this, but let's move to what I think has been really a symbol of your leadership at DBS, which has been the digital transformation journey that you've been on. And what is your view of that journey? And can we have sort of it from sort of the horse's mouth, how you have seen this journey and how you've driven it, and what are some of the significant achievements, especially now with the last 2 years? So I leave it to you to describe that in your own words.
Yeah. So Prabhat, the actual journey began, I guess, around 2013. And it had its origins in 2 or 3 catalysts. First, I was trying to acquire a bank in the region in Indonesia. You couldn't acquire a bank in most countries. In India, China, banking is very protectionist. But even the Indonesians changed the rules on us halfway. And so I realized this growth through acquisitions is not going to work. I tried to grow in the big markets organically, and it hadn't been very successful. So I was in any case pondering about how do you skin this cat differently. Around that time, it was quite strange that banking came late to digital disruption, or digital disruption came late to banking, because Amazon and book selling and music and Spotify all happened before financial services, which is actually ironic because all banking and financial services is only information and accounting entries. So we should have been disrupted much earlier. But around then, in the early part of 2010 onwards, you started seeing the unbundling of the banking financial chain. Lending, savings, wealth management, payments. You started seeing the startups come up. But perhaps the most important thing was I ran into Jack Ma. In fact, I had breakfast with him.
I see.
And he scared the living daylights out of me in a 45-minute session, because it was quite clear to me that his vision for the future of financial services was going to be a complete game changer, using data, using technology, etc. And I remember coming back and talking to my people and saying, if we don't adapt to this new world, we're all going to be history in 5 years. So that was the catalyst. One of the things we did very early is we started reaching out to a lot of the big techs around the world. So, we reached out to Google and Amazon and Alibaba themselves. And I very quickly, between me and my CIO, we came to 2 or 3 important realizations. One was that the big tech business model, you could actually frame it quite simply. Number one is customer acquisition. Their approach to customer acquisition is completely digital. They don't have feet on street. They don't have brick and mortar. They don't have physical infrastructure. Whether you're Facebook or Amazon or Google, you acquire billions of customers completely digitally. Whereas in banking, we've been used to branch distribution, sales forces, people peddling credit cards in the shopping malls. Completely different customer acquisition model. The second obvious realization was that the fulfillment model was instant. So they did not have paper; it was all electronic, and you saw instant fulfillment. If you thought about banking, when I started my career, you used to give me a demand draft application on Monday. I gave you a demand draft on Wednesday. And along the way, we were able to do, same day, morning, evening, and we thought we were heroes. So as I told some of my people, can you imagine in Google, you put in something in the morning and gives you a response in the evening? Now, obviously, they've raised the bar for what the customer expectation is. And so that obviously means you've got to kill paper. And you can only get that level of fulfillment if you kill paper entirely. And the third big thing I realized is the way of marketing was totally different. In traditional industries, our customer lifetime value came from the fact that cost of customer acquisition is high. So the more product you could pump into a customer over the lifetime, the more money you could make. But big tech changed that. They switched it from what I call a cross-sell model to a cross-buy model. And Amazon Prime was a great example. If you focused on customer convenience and a great customer journey, the customer automatically got seduced into doing more and more of you. You got more of the customer's wallet just because you created the convenience in the way the customer could work. So we embraced these 2-3 big things and said, okay, this is what we're going to try to do to digitize ourselves. We actually created a whole program of change. So changing our tech architecture was one thing. Really thinking customer journeys, the Clay Christensen work on job to be done. We embraced that at scale. And then obviously we focused a lot on trying to create a culture of a startup, which is being nimble, being adaptive, but most importantly, having the capacity to take some risk and experiment. Most legacy companies are wary of doing that. Now, fast forward, a couple of other things the big techs do, which has been really instrumental to us in the 2 years in the COVID. One is that the sales process, instead of going direct to customer, whether direct to consumer or direct to corporate, they operate through ecosystems and platforms. And in doing that, they effectively wind up where the customer is. You serve the customer in context where the customer wants to be. Now, we started doing that, and in the COVID, it became extremely powerful because people were locked up in their homes. Supply chains are breaking down, and so the fact that we re-architected ourselves to have 1,000 APIs, and we could plug into platforms, plug into ecosystems, plug into supply chains, that turned out to be fantastically good for us. In fact, over the last 2 years, because in fact, 2018 or 19. I'd already started pushing this idea of plugging API connectivity into all supply chains. And in the early days of COVID, it just, when people started facing supply chain problems, transparency, resiliency, etc., this was a massive, massive win for us. In 2 years, our volumes on trade finance, payments, etc., have gone up manyfold. And just because we've connectively and electronically plugged into all of these kinds of things. So that was a big win. And that came from really thinking about it, how the way big tech does. The other big thing we started working on, it's been a long journey, is the hardest part of the journey, is data and AI. Again, we started working on it. You need to master data. How do you capture data, data policies, appropriateness of data use, metadata. So it's not an easy journey, but we've been working on it for a few years. And again, over the last 2 years, when direct customer connectivity started this thing being a challenge, people weren't coming in, people weren't going out, we realized that using data and using AI could make a big difference in the overall customer outcomes that you could get. I was, last year we started measuring, and we did the usual control group and, a sample group. Our own assessment is that we made about $100 million delta in our economics, just because we are now using some 300 AI ML models across the company. And a lot of that happened in the last couple of years. So yeah, the first 3 I talked to you about, I think of those today as table stakes. Frankly, through COVID, there's no company which has not mastered that, creating employees working from home, giving customers digital product, letting customers come in and do some stuff. But the overlay on that, AI, data, and some of the stuff around ecosystems and platforms, I think that's still not table stakes. If you can master that, you can still continue to create space between yourself and competition. And the last thing that we were able to do in the last couple of years is, I'm convinced that the future is blockchain. And blockchain, and particularly if you marry that with the form factor of AR, VR, so loosely called in metaverse. But this whole idea of blockchain and everything that comes off it, smart contracts, person-to-person connectivity, tokenization of everything, value tokenization, you could argue digital currencies, crypto. I think we're on the cusp of massive changes. And so we also were able to use this last year or two to put some more focus in the fire. We launched a crypto exchange. We launched a new settlement process with a few partners. We launched a carbon exchange and a carbon exchange trading platform. A lot of that is to do with blockchain. So, and I'm throwing a lot of it at you, but as I just said, explain in whichever we can. It's been a fascinating journey, but I think we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, this is a masterclass on on digitalization that I just went through, and I guess this is almost like you've created a virtuous cycle that is keeping you at the forefront of technology by doing
this. Yeah. So probably maybe we'll talk about it later, but see, I want to go back to this program of change. I'm a big believer in change for programmatic change. Yeah, and like I said, to recap, the one pillar is just technology. One of the things I learned, I'd also grown up in the old school, but we learned is the modern tech stack, cloud, what they call it, cloud native, cloud enabled tech stack, is really superior. It's quicker, it's far cheaper, it's open source, and you can do things with it that you could never do 10, 15 years ago. So committing to moving to the new tech stack was the first pillar. I saw that, interestingly, despite we all think that the Googles and Facebooks and Apples were all born with new technology. Actually, that's not true. If you think about the late 90s, early 2000s, many of them had, IBM mainframes, big data centers, and Oracle databases. So the change really started happening with AWS and their embrace of web services. In fact, it's a well-known story. In 2009, as late as that, Netflix had a very famous 3-day outage in New York. And that's when AWS came knocking and said, look, why don't you convert to our technology given what we've done? So Netflix took 6 years to change, and today they're cutting edge in terms of experimentation. I found most of the big tech firms had taken anything from 4 to 7 years to restack their technology. We gave ourselves 4 years to do it because we said we are, a follower, and we're 5, 7 years later. And by and large, we were able to get it done in 4, 5 years. So that was the first pillar. You got to commit to the tech stack. One virtuous positive from that is your cost of technology operations reduces. And so you can devote more of your expenditure to really this cool cutting edge stuff. You spend less on keeping the lights on. And since you save some money, you can reinvest it. But the second and third pillars, the second is this thing about customer journey. I'm convinced that it's not just technology. When I think about, taxi companies, for example, it's not like taxi companies did not use technology before Uber came along. Yeah. Or it's not like hotels did not use technology before Airbnb came along. Yeah. So in fact, the second thing, which was really thinking about what is the true job to be done? What are you trying to solve? And then using the technology to craft the right customer solutions. I think that's mission critical. And once you get that, but to do that, you have to train everybody. We trained our whole company on journey thinking. We developed this 4D process on how to map outside in. We ran hackathons to teach people. My whole board, I took the whole board in 2 days and got them to do journeys as well. So that psyche, which is putting the customer genuinely at the center, working outside in from the customer inward, that's a really important part of the virtuous cycle. And what it does is, in addition to just customer outcomes, it changes the mindset of the people. Because you now have a rubric which says if it makes sense for the customer experience, go ahead and do it. You need that to complement the technology shifts you make. Otherwise, you don't get the same kind of outcomes. And I guess the third pillar, like I said, the culture, I'd spent 3, 4, 5 years, my first 4, 5 years at DBS trying to create a multinational culture. And then, come 2014, 15, I said, well, forget all that. Let's start all over again. We're going to make a startup culture. And so, we really programmed for that as well. How do you create a culture which is sort of agile at scale, to be more nimble, to be more adaptive, to take risk, etc. Now, that doesn't come easy either in a regulated industry like ours in particular.
Yeah.
So you need all three ingredients to work before the virtuous circle kicks in. And then you start getting outcomes which you're not directing because they're coming bottoms up.
So the three things, just to capture that for our audience, you are saying the commitment to the tech stack and therefore the efficiencies and the agility, the experimentation that allowed, the focus on the customer journey and working backwards from the customer all the time. And then finally, the startup culture were the key pillars around which you've been able to build this.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about this 4D process. Is this like a design thinking kind of process?
Yeah, pretty similar. So it's to discover, to design, to develop, and to deploy. There's the 4D. But the discovery is important because, one of the things that certainly in our industry we never did is really practice through discovery, which means not just, imagining our own heads what the customer wants. This is the famous IKEA thing. What do you need a drill for? It's not to drill a hole in the wall. It is to really hang the painting. And frankly, it's not even to hang the painting. It is to create memories or create some. So going deep down to what is the true emotional, functional thing the customer is looking for. Now, I'll tell you two things which are important thing. For example, today we have like 15 ethnographers in the bank. So anthropology and ethnography is not something you'd ever associate with the bank. But we realize that if you really want to have a deep understanding of the customer expected, what the customer wants, you have to do deep observation. It's not superficial. So that's part of the discovery phase. And then the design phase, that is the other piece. So, design was not a big banking thing. Apple did design, banks didn't do design. But today I have 150 designers from 58 different countries. And our designers are from everywhere, from the Apples of the world and from, IDEO and all of the big design firms. Because it's quite clear that design matters. Design in the electronic properties we have, but also design in the physical customer experience we create, right? And so, and then to develop and deploy, one of the things in the development process, since a lot of our products are technology, we really were very early to switch from the waterfall method to the agile method.
Right.
And that changes the development life cycle. What used to be 9-12 months of development life cycle, and at the end of that, once you tested something, half the times the user said the market has changed, we don't need this anymore. So the 2-week sprints with scrums and agile coaches and doing things and prototyping, that really changed our speed to market quite enormously. So the development process and the deployment process, taking it to market. So the 4Ds work quite nicely for us. We teach people all of this in a 5-day program, with the usual sticky post-it notes and stand-up routines and so on. But we give people actually problems to solve. In fact, my KPI for the company in 2015, if I remember, was that every one of my 2 downs, which is about 300 people, everybody had to run a journey, either a customer employee journey, and everybody had to deploy the 4D method. So it didn't matter to me what the journey was. I went and physically checked to make sure you understood what was required and you knew how to do it, right? And so that's how you build the habit.
Amazing, amazing. You talked about this whole shift in culture. I mean, changing culture is not easy, particularly in a very venerable, respected, old institution. And then to go from a multinational culture, which you were trying to create, to this agile culture. What were some of the learnings there, Piyush? I mean, everybody wants to do this today. Right? They all want to become like startups.
Yeah. So, you're right. Actually, the movement to multinational culture wasn't that straightforward. But you've got to understand that DBS is an offshoot of the government. So we were sort of, actually, we are the Singapore State Bank of India. Sure. And perhaps even more bureaucratic because we were, came from the Economic Development Board. Until the year 2000, we didn't have professional banking leadership. One of the secretaries to the government would be rotated out to run the bank for 5 years. And the next assignment would be health or, defense or something. So, even moving that culture to being, this thing was not easy. One of the things I obviously did, having come from Citi, switch to first name. Try to create a more meritocratic organization. Try to encourage a lot more internal mobility in the system. tried to get individual accountability as opposed to committee, all committees doing stuff. So, I mean, that is all part of the early changes we had to make. But the more difficult thing, as you correctly pointed out, is how do you create the startup culture, especially in a regulated industry? And one of my learnings has been that, you can shape culture, culture by design, I call it. Cultures don't get formed from sending emails out. Cultures are behavior practices. How do you create a set of behaviors that people start following? And on top of that, obviously, you've got to create the right incentive mechanisms. You've got to reward and recognize the right things. But shaping behaviors is also quite a science. So we came up with something called BEANS. BEAN stands for a behavior enabler and nudge, BEAN. So how do you create artifacts that encourage certain behaviors? And how do you create nudges that encourage people to do some things? So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we wanted to do, which a lot of startups do, is encourage a lot of dissent, dialogue, dissent, so people on the spot can sort of air their opinions. And we were still a company where a lot of people look up to hierarchy. So, this is the traditional hierarchical construct and culture, not that easy to change. We learned from Netflix, actually, when we were, we went out in the world to see what we could learn from different people. And Netflix had something called a chaos monkey. And it was only in the context of technology. So what they would do is every time they created a technology app, they would release this quote unquote virtual chaos monkey whose only job was to go and try and destroy the app. And that was to make sure the app was finally robust, because the chaos monkey could destroy the app, then they had to go and fix it again. So my tech people had taken that idea and brought it into our technology realm to say, could we do something like that? Except we didn't want to call it chaos monkey. So we called it a raccoon. So we used the animal, the raccoon animal, but we spelled it with a WRECK. So the idea is you introduce the raccoon and can go and wreck everything that's over there. And we created a mascot, a visual around it, saying this raccoon will go and see if your applications are strong and stable. Now, my transformation team actually took this and said, this idea works. And if we want to create psychological safety and dissent and encourage people to ask the tough questions, why don't we take this raccoon idea and make it part of everything we do in the bank? And so we took raccoon as a bean, a behavior enabler, and we told people that every time you're having a project, you're doing a presentation, it's a discussion, somewhere along the deck, perhaps towards the end, you need to have a page where the raccoon shows up. And the raccoon then forces everybody to stop and say, what can wreck this? What could fundamentally change our assumptions? What can wreck the whole idea? And that gives everybody the air cover and safety to start asking the difficult questions and the questions that they weren't willing to ask before. It became so popular, it's become a verb. So people would now say, okay, let me take a raccoon moment in the middle of nowhere, or let me ask a raccoon question. And the minute you use the word, it creates the psychological safety to dissent. Now, that's a great example of a bean that's allowed us to build this culture of creating dissent and creating conversation and questioning ourselves. But you need something like that. And so we've sort of gone to town with this raccoon symbol and so on. That's an example of how you shape culture by design. I mean, a few more these things that we've done over the years.
Fascinating.
But you've got to focus and work, and then obviously you've got to reward the right behavior. So I'll give you another example: risk taking. So we wanted to reward people for taking some risks and experimenting. But on risk taking, this is not a new one. A lot of companies have done it. We realized that our call center operators were not empowered. So the biggest calls we get are people wanting to get a waiver on the credit card fee. And what would happen is the call center operator would have to go to their boss every time to say, hey, can I waive the fee on this particular person or not? And it was just a clunky journey because the customer took time. We went and, it took a long time. Oftentimes you couldn't get back in time. So what was the issue? The issue was to empower the call center operator meant taking a risk, because these kids, the young kids, you train them for 2 months and put them on the phone. So they could make mistakes. We could wind up giving away a lot of money. We could, refund money to people who weren't deserving. But we looked at it and said, okay, what is the downside risk of doing that? And we dimensioned it to a few $1 million. And we said, fine, let's risk it. We'll take a chance and see what happens. Now, as things happen, these kids are smarter than the bosses are. They know exactly who should be given a refund and who shouldn't be. And so we didn't lose the money. It improved the customer experience and it empowered the people at the front end but more importantly, it sent a great signal down the line that we are willing to take a risk on even financial risk to see if you got good outcomes. So we actually programmed for a lot of this stuff.
Fascinating examples, because I think this whole ability, you've talked about two very critical things, which I don't know if you deliberately did, but I feel are very important in the kind of culture you're creating. One is to be able to take risks, and the other is to be able to ask the tough questions. And for both of these, looks like you put in place some really deliberate measures to make sure.
And some of it then gets opportunistic. So going back to, so another one, some years ago, we had a problem with our ATMs. And, to cut a long story short, people can phish your ATMs by putting a small chip, where the card reader is. That's what the crooks do. And the only way to get around it is you introduce an alternative device called a jammer. It jams the card. And so it makes it harder to be skimmed, but it only improves your odds by 5-7%. And one of our guys had turned off this thing, the jitter it's called. One of my ops guys had turned off the jitter because they said the improvement is small and it increases cycle time, so it's not worth it. Now, as things happened, we got skimmed, we lost $1 million, and the central bank came to us and said, "Who turned off your jitters?" And one of the guys had, and they said, "Oh, you should hold the person accountable." And we looked at it and we thought the guy had acted perfectly reasonably. He'd justification, he'd made a good, sensible trade-off. And so we told the central bank, we're not only not going to hold the guy accountable, we're going to give him an award for having used his brain. Now, again, this is opportunistic. But again, the story went down the system. And so the fact that you're willing to reward risk-taking and sensible risk-taking, that gives people the confidence saying it's okay to do this.
Yeah, you created the case studies and the stories and propagated it, and that really helps build confidence. Fantastic. As you talked about risk, there's an inevitable question that somebody's asking, which is somewhat related from our audience, where they're saying, with all the debate around privacy and data in different sectors, is there a way to escape the privacy security dichotomy and sort of imagine life beyond it? And how have you tackled this? Because I'm sure that's one of the big things that's thrown at you, saying, "Oh, you can't do this."
So it's actually a very hard question. It's one of the toughest questions to deal with. And just forget that I'll come back to the security and secrecy, but I'll tell you the data privacy question. On the one hand, data is just hugely powerful. And I want to make data available to all of our people and use the data and insights to do the right things for our customers. And as you know, data is very powerful. I can give you recommendations that you won't know before. I can help manage risks that you couldn't manage before. So it is very powerful. But on the other hand, misuse of data is also very easy. So data privacy, invasion, getting this thing. So how do you, draw the line? Not easy. But the first thing you got to remember is that data privacy is not an absolute. It's a very relative concept. And let me give you 4 or 5, different prisms to that. First, 2000 years ago, what we consider private was not private. And everybody all lived in the same tent in the old caveman days, and everybody fornicated and made babies, and nobody thought twice about it. In the Roman times, people, men and women all went together to the Roman public baths, and you didn't think twice about it. Our notions of privacy have evolved over time. A lot of what we think today is absolute is really Victorian England. That's where it comes from. But if you go back to the 1870s, when the US invented the post and telegraph, for example, in the beginning, it was okay for the postman to open your letter and read it. They had to create a special law saying this is private. Or when Kodak invented the photograph, there's a big debate on whether it was okay to take somebody's photograph or not. Is it private or not? So these notions of privacy evolve over time. The second is privacy is very different depending on where you are. The Western liberal thought on the privacy of the individual is not necessarily shared by a lot of the Asians, where society and community good often trumps individual privacy. And that happens the whole time. So, when the first COVID case happened, I used every big data to figure out who the first degree contacts of the person might be. We used door style data and door tab data and Outlook data. And I wrote an op-ed on it in the Financial Times about how my AI was so good. I got hammered, I got flamed in the social media because all the Westerners said you shouldn't be using employee data for this stuff. As far as my employees were concerned, they loved the idea that I could protect them by using data. So I think privacy, varies by culture. Privacy varies by generation. How my kids feel about privacy is very different from how I feel about privacy. And what they're willing to give up or not is different from what I am. Frankly, privacy also varies from morning to evening in my own mind. In my morning, I say I don't want to give up anything. In the evening, you tell me you get 30% off on your next, golf set. I'm quite happy to give you my email and my phone number because I get a 30% deal. So the value exchange changes my view on privacy. And finally, I think privacy, what you say is very different from what you do. And if I ask you, are you prepared to be tracked 24/7 all the time? People know where you are, you'll say no. And then I'll tell you, show me a mobile phone. Location is on half your devices. You've got Google Maps on. You've got, Uber or this thing on. So everybody knows where you are all the time. So what you do is very different from what you think you do. So there is no absolute agenda on privacy, which means you cannot program for saying this is okay, this is not okay. So what we've done at DBS, though, recognizing that this is such an important issue, we've focused a lot on appropriate use of data. And we've created a whole committee, a standing committee, which focuses on what data seems right to use, headline test, will the customer expect us to know this, etc. We came up with a rubric we call PURE. So data must be purposeful, unsurprising, respectful, and explainable. So if you can use PURE principles, then you can determine whether the customer would be okay with you using the data in a particular way or not. Now, even this doesn't work 100%. But at least we've set up a forum which forces us to think through the issues, forces us to think about what could be construed as being creepy, and then making a judgment call on is this okay or not okay. So we go through a regular process to try and do that. In recent times, as you know, there's been a lot of advancement. All the big tech, the Googles, Microsoft have done a lot of work around it. The EU is now in the process of issuing a directive, a regulatory directive. And they've defined 11 principles of what you should be able to put in place if you're using AI in particular, data in general, but artificial intelligence in particular. So, how your models should be, how you should test the models, how you should make sure there's no bias, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of work being done around the world, and we stay quite close to this and make sure we embrace some of these ideas in our own thinking of what we can and cannot do. Now, parallel to this is the tracker on data security. Now, obviously, I want to use all of this stuff, but at the same time, your big risk is, the data leak issue, data going out is a serious risk to anybody. And so we do the same stuff as most big companies do. We have a lot of peripheral defense. I call it the onion peel strategy. I've got 7 layers of the onion you need to get through before you get inside the bank. And, hopefully you get tripped up at one of those layers. But we also have an answer. We assume at some stage, somebody leave a window open and somebody will get in. And so we focus very hard on, I call it inside is the real outside, because you've got to assume if somebody gets in, how do you deal with that? And the only way you can deal with that is to make sure that you have massive degree of micro-segmentation in your internal system so people can get into a small territory, but not the whole. And then we use a lot of data and AI again to actually do tracking of behavior. So we know the minute there's a aberration in what we would normally expect to happen internally, something pops up in our screens which says, hey, something looks like it's, for example, if you normally access your bank account from Delhi and now suddenly I get you accessing it from Seattle, something will pop up in the system saying, hey, you should check this out. This is not usual behavior. So we do a lot of behavior analytics and AI to pop out the things that look unusual, just in case somebody's managed to get it.
Fascinating. Can you repeat the full form of the acronym?
Yeah, it's PURE. So P is for purposeful, U is for unsurprising, R is for respectful, and E is for explainable. And so the unsurprising, for example, purposeful, for example, the idea is the data has got to be of purposeful use to either the individual or the community. You've got to be able to demonstrate what is the good coming out of what you're doing. Unsurprising is that the customer should not suddenly say, hey, how did the bank get to know this, right? So it should be something the customer normally expects the bank to have or have access to, and so on.
Lovely. I love that. You have quite a few of these, the PURE, the beans. I'm going to remember those.
Well, this one, I go back to saying you got to program. I'm convinced that you have to, if you have to program change, how do you communicate? How do you capture things in a way that you can get into people's heads and memories? And this is a good way to do it. You got to have these small mnemonics, programs, and then people start talking them up.
You talked a lot about relevance, and and that sustainability comes from being relevant. And you've had such an illustrious and long career. Do you see the role of companies changing in terms of their relevance? And how should people be thinking about that to be sustainable?
So, Pramod, I think my view is there has been a little bit of a shift. In fact, in the West, in the US in particular, there's been quite an important shift. Where I think people have taken Friedman's shareholder value thing to an extreme. With the notion, and I mean, Friedman's not an idiot. I mean, he had good logic for saying that all the company and the management should do is to work for the shareholder. Because his point was that, if you have other good to do, let the shareholder make the decision. You as an agent of the shareholder should not make the decision. And, when I tell people, anybody who criticizes Friedman, I tell them, think about it. Suppose you give your friend $1,000 to invest. The friend makes a 10% return, but instead of returning 100 to you, he only returns 70 and says, I took the decision to take $30 and donate it on your behalf. And you're going to tell him, you better give me my 100, let me make my, donation decision. Now, this is Friedman's argument. And it's not a bad argument, let the shareholder decide what to do with the $100. The problem with that argument is that when you take it to the extreme, and Friedman's underlying thesis was, as long as you're legal, you should do whatever you want. But I am of the view that, you have multiple constituencies, stakeholders. And when you're given form as a legal vehicle, as a legal entity, I think in addition to rights as a legal entity, which are limited liability, you also are given responsibilities as a legal entity. And those responsibilities as a legal entity, you cannot walk away from. You cannot just say the agency says, somebody else is going to make the call. It's a bizarre parallel, but to me, the best way to think about it is Nazi Germany. If you were a Nazi soldier, a lot of people said that, I did what I was told to do. Finally, it's Hitler's fault. But you got to go back and say, don't you have your own agency? And don't you have your own mind? And aren't you expected to also determine yourself what is the right thing to do? Now, my view on corporate relevance is that you cannot just say as a shareholder, you have been given a relevance, you've been given form. And so you have it's an expectation that you must be doing stuff that is useful or relevant to community and society. By the way, I also and if over a sustained period of time, civil society determines that you're not bringing value to them, you'll find it very hard to survive. And so if you really want to survive for the long term, you've got to earn that license from civil society as well. And I also believe that in reality, there's not that much a disconnect between the shareholder-stakeholder thing. It's a time frame question. In the short term, if you have a quarterly outlook, of course, you can say the disconnect. I want to produce the extra 2% for the shareholder or not. But the minute you think long term and say, what is in the shareholder's long-term interest? Well, the shareholder's long-term interest is that you must survive for the long term. Otherwise, how do you determine a return? And the only way you can survive for the long term is if you have society and community interests in mind. Otherwise, they won't let you survive. So really, if you expand the time frame, I think the dichotomy actually disappears in many ways. So I guess based on all that, you can see where I come out on this debate. I think it's quite important for companies to be clear about what is your purpose and why do you exist. Now, I was fortunate that DBS, this was there long before I came, because DBS got created with the express purpose of helping Singapore industrialize. That's why they've carved it out of the Economic Development Board and created a development institution. So that was deeply ingrained in the ethos of DBS. When I went through the archives, I realized in the first decade, nobody talked about profit. So DBS's whole agenda was, is it good for Singapore? We should do it. So you build that whole mind frame. In fact, along the way, when they merged the Postal Savings Bank with DBS, that further underlined, re-emphasized that, because the Postal Savings Bank, for 150 years, their mantra was neighbors first, bankers second. It's all about the community and helping build the savings habit of the community. So I've been fortunate that the sense of purpose has been deeply embedded in the DNA and the fabric of DBS. But even outside of that, I serve on several boards and companies. And it's been my principal thing that this idea of being purposeful, this idea of intent, it cannot be words on paper. You've got to really understand, what are you going to do that makes you relevant to community, society, or country? Otherwise, you're not going to be around for the long term.
I think what you just articulated, Piyush, is very powerful. And I think every CEO and every person running even a small or a big enterprise needs to hear that. I think you've thought it through very nicely, and it fits in seamlessly with all of the shareholder value stuff, because what you're basically saying is, listen, you have agency, and that's why you are put in the seat you are, and you go ahead and take charge. Listen, I don't want to take up too much time, and I want to wrap up too on time. And I had thought that maybe we won't stretch you beyond 45 minutes, but a couple of quick last ones. One, obviously everybody is curious. So where do you think banking is going to go in the next 50 years? And is there one thing that you think that there's going to be a big shift that's going to happen in the world, not just banking, that you would want to talk about?
Well, I think there are a lot of shifts, but I'm going to come back. So, I think that 2 or 3 big things which are going to be defining from it. One's obviously geopolitics. I think we are going, some people would argue back to bipolarity, so Cold War. I think we are going into a more multipolar kind of world. If you go back to the original Cold War, you had an online movement, which you had, so I think you're going to see that. You're going to see a lot more countries like India, especially the bigger countries like India, who are going to do what's in their self-interest. But beyond that, you are going to see the East Bloc and the West Bloc. And so that plays into the whole deglobalization agenda. Or in the context of India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat agenda. I think you're going to see traces of that around the world. So that's one big change. I think the second big change you're going to see is around sustainability. I think without a doubt, that train has left the station. And even though in the next year or so with energy and oil and gas and so on, you might see a step back. People are burning more coal and oil as we speak. But I do think at the same time that shift to more renewable energy, non-fossil fuel energy is on us. I also think in the coming decade, this whole idea of social equity and redistribution as opposed to wealth accumulation, I think that will play out. And again, I think to a large extent, the current administration in India has been doing that. That's what the Modi government has been focused on, whether it's the low end up, the accounts and the gas and so on, education, public health. But I think you'll see a lot more of that around the world. But I think one of the third thing which goes to what you're saying, I alluded to this earlier. The power of blockchain as a technology is very, very fundamental. If you look at the architecture of the world we built again, not just the financial architecture, anything else, it's all a hub and spoke arrangement. So a stock exchange is a central place, a bank is a central place, a central bank is a central place, a registrar society which tracks who owns which house or who says who's got which mortgage. All of these are hub and spoke arrangements. So you need somebody in the center holding a khata. And the khata, they keep track of who owes and who owns. Right? Now, what the blockchain does effectively is it uses smart contracts and person to person. So it can completely eliminate this hub and spoke arrangement. The Web3 evangelists effectively make the case that we're going to be 8 billion self-sovereigns, or whatever the population of the world is. And each one of us will deal with each other as a self-sovereign purely based on smart contracts and blockchain. Now, if you take this evangelism to the extreme, I don't think we'll get there, but for a minute, if you did, it would mean the end not just of banks or stock exchange of central banks. It could theoretically mean the end of governments and nation states as we know them. Yeah. Because everybody is a citizen and everybody deals with everybody else as a citizen of one. Right? I don't think it gets there because there's some profound challenges, and I don't think the Westphalian nation state is going to disappear anytime soon. But you can see where this could go. Sure. But the underlying layer, even if you don't get to that extreme, what the blockchain technology does do, though, it will change the back office of the world, and certainly has the power to change the back office of banking. The clearing and settlement systems, the trade finance systems, the foreign exchange settlement system, everything can change because of this nature of a distributed ledger. You don't need to keep the khata in the center. Sure. Then the second thing on top of that, which I think this will lead to, without a doubt, I think you're going to see tokenization of all value. And it's already there. If you think about how we've thought about value, particularly money, it evolved. It would just be cowrie shells, then it went into metal, then it went into paper, then it went into plastic. It's not illogical. Technology leads to a change in your thinking about how do you manifest value. So I think that is going to come. Already when you think about, scripts and bonds, we used to have them in paper form. In the last 30 years, nobody's seen a paper share anymore. It's all got digitized. So, well, you should expect everything to get tokenized. And the only difference between what we have today and the future is you can fractionalize it into 0.0001 of anything. But whether it's your painting or your car or your physics, everything is going to get digitalized, tokenized, and fractionalized. And that creates a completely different sense of how do you move and store value around. So I think that will happen without a doubt. And then the third layer on top of that, which I think will happen, though maybe not in the form that people think, I think you will start seeing a lot more digital money. By that, I don't necessarily mean Bitcoin. I'm not necessarily making the case for private money, but I am making the case for digital money because I see central banks will also figure, why do you have to issue rupees and, notes and coins? I can just effectively get everybody and issue digital money to everybody. I think so. Central bank digital currencies will happen. I think a cross-border settlement mechanism across central bank digital currencies will happen. And I do think the parallel universe of, cryptos, the Bitcoins, etc., there might not be money in the sense of a unit of account or a store of value, but a unit of account or a medium of exchange, but there will certainly be a store of value. There's $3 trillion of the stuff floating around already. So I can see that being a sort of quasi-gold. You don't use it to pay each other, but it is a store of value. So I think that will happen. I think what will also happen is when you couple that with what you're seeing with non-fungible tokens, right? And the idea that people can attribute value in strange ways to other kinds of stuff. Today, people are issuing NFTs for everything. I think you'll start seeing a lot more of that. So, the fundamentals of banking are quite simple, Ron. People have extra money, they want to save it. You want to move the money around, you want to invest the money. So I think the fundamentals don't really change. But the form factor in which you do these fundamentals, that can change quite dramatically. And I think it will change quite dramatically over the next 5-10 years.
Fantastic. One last question, a personal one. Are there any particular personal habits or principles that you would attribute to your personal achievements and success in life that you'd like to share with the audience? Anyone? Anything that you...
Well, I would maybe answer it in two ways. So first is in terms of habits. I've just been fortunate and I've developed that habit over the years of being able to sort of compartmentalize my brain. So I don't bring work home. And the reverse is also true. I don't take the home to work. So I'm constantly in trouble with my wife because I forget things she told me to do. Yeah. But I think it helps. So people call it work-life balance. I don't think that's so. I love my work, so I don't need the balance. But I do create me time. And I sort of spend time and do my yoga meditation in the morning, or my weekends I make sure I do my bird watching or golf. So creating those pockets of me time I found are always very important. And it helps my productivity as well. So that's a personal habit, if you will. One of the things I've changed, evolved as a manager and leader over the years. Again, I mean, some leadership is immutable. You need to have a point of view. You need to build a team. But I forget who, a Drucker or somebody said, culture beats strategy, or eat strategy for breakfast. I learned that over the years that, your left brain is important, having a point of view, strategy, pulling this thing together. But finally, if you really want to get outperformance, you've got to focus on creating a culture where everybody's doing the same thing. It's not you who are directing and leading, but individuals, know what they need to do. And then you can just sit back and enjoy the fruits of a lot of people doing stuff. But that can only happen if you really focus on shaping the culture, what I call culture by design. So that's something I learned over the years.
Piyush, this has been such an amazing session for me personally. And I don't mean to say this out of the formality of thanking somebody, but just I learned so much from listening to you. And I'm sure people who are the audience that were tuning in today and who will watch the recording will feel the same way. It's been fascinating. And I do want to tell you that you're a master craftsman in the way you've kind of...
No, you embarrassed me, Pramod, but thank you. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. And the range of issues, I mean, I'd love to sometime ask you how you've kept yourself abreast. I mean, you're clearly an individual who really has a learning mindset. You've learned about everything so deeply, and that's very inspiring. So thank you for inspiring us today. Thank you for making the time. And I hope to meet you in person sometime soon, but keep doing the great stuff you're doing and keep talking about it because it's very valuable. Trust me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Gwen.
Thank you so much, Venan.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.